The night I showed up at your door with blood on my sleeve and a story I couldn't tell. You didn't ask a single question, you just opened the door like you'd been expecting me. Like you already knew that I was seconds away from falling apart in ways that wouldn't leave pretty pieces behind. And when I stepped inside, soaked from the rain, breathing like I had outrun something that still had its hands around my throat. You didn't flinch, didn't freeze, didn't even blink. You just took one look at me and said, "Kay," like you understood that I didn't have the language for what I was carrying. And that word, so small, so quiet, was the first thread I held onto as everything else inside me threatened to unravel. And I still remember how I stood there, dripping onto your floor, shoulders shaking with things I couldn't name. And instead of asking what happened, you handed me a towel, warm from the dryer, smelling like safety, and told me to sit, and I did. Legs folding under me like they had finally found somewhere they could be weak without consequence. And you made tea without asking how I took it, just placed it in front of me and sat on the floor beside me, not too close, not too far. Just close enough for me to feel the shape of your presence against the storm still echoing in my ribs. And we sat like that for what felt like hours, maybe more. The air between us holding something I hadn't touched in a long time, room to breathe, room to be, room to exist without being explained. And eventually, when the shaking stopped and the tea grew cold and the blood dried in a crusted pattern I couldn't stop staring at, I said your name like it was a question, like it was a lifeline. And you answered like it was an answer. And somehow that was enough. Because the truth is, I didn't come to be fixed or forgiven. I came because some part of me knew you would hold my chaos like it was a secret, like it was something sacred. Like it wasn't something to be solved, but something to be understood. And you didn't ask what I had done, where I had been, why I looked like I had been cracked open and stitched back together with borrowed thread. You just told me I was safe now. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I believed it. And over the next few days, I didn't leave, not because I was ready to stay, but because your apartment felt like the kind of quiet that didn't demand explanations, the kind of silence that wrapped around you without judgment. And I moved through your space like a ghost, learning how to live again, finding pieces of myself in the things you left behind: half-read books on the nightstand, chipped mugs with your name written underneath in marker, music playing from speakers even when you weren't in the room. And in those small things, I felt something like recognition, like my chaos had found a mirror instead of a wall. And even though I still couldn't tell you what had happened, even though the words caught in my throat like splinters, you never pushed, never pried, just stayed nearby, anchoring me without tying me down. And every time I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, breath caught in my lungs like a scream too tired to escape, I'd find you in the kitchen, always with a second mug in your hand, already filled with tea I hadn't asked for, and we'd sit on the floor, backs against the cabinets, our shadows flickering in the stovelight. And in that dim silence, something began to shift. Something began to settle, not like healing exactly, but like breathing without pain. And I told you things in pieces, fragments, scattered moments that didn't make sense on their own, and you never tried to piece them together, never tried to make a story out of a confession that wasn't ready to be whole. And when I asked why, you never asked more, never doubted me, never turned me away. You just looked at me and said, because when someone's chaos looks like yours, it means they survived something that wanted them gone. And I didn't have words for that, didn't know how to carry the weight of being seen so clearly without falling apart. So I cried instead, quietly, into your shoulder, while you held me like I wasn't broken, just bent. And I think that's when I began to believe in softness again, not as weakness, but as survival, as defiance, as a kind of courage no one teaches you. And every day after that became something sacred. Not because it was perfect, but because you let it be real. Let it be ugly and uneven and trembling. And even when I left months later, when I finally walked back into the world with trembling hands and half-finished stories. I carried your quiet with me like armor, like memory, like proof that someone once held all my chaos without turning away, and even now, when things go dark again, when the silence gets sharp and the nights get long, I close my eyes and remember the sound of your voice in the dark, steady and calm, saying, "You don't have to tell me everything, just stay." And I think maybe that's what love really is. Not a promise, not a vow, not even a name, just someone who sees your wreckage and says, "I'll keep it safe," and means it. There was a morning when I woke up on your couch to the sound of birds and the smell of something burning slightly in the kitchen. And for a split second, before I remembered where I was, before I remembered I was safe, my whole body froze like it always did, heart sprinting, lungs locked, thoughts racing for exits that didn't exist. And then I heard your voice, soft and laughing, swearing under your breath about the toast, and I swear I could feel something inside me exhale for the first time in months, like my fear had been waiting for a reason to rest, and it finally found one in the rhythm of your ordinary. And I lay there watching dust dance in the morning light, cutting through your curtains. And I thought about how strange it was to feel safe in someone else's space, to feel known in a place where I had given nothing, explained nothing, offered nothing except the ruined shape of myself, and yet you still looked at me like I wasn't a burden, like I wasn't a collection of broken decisions wrapped in silence and shame. And when you brought me a plate of slightly burnt toast with a crooked smile and said, "Breakfast is ugly but honest," I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the kind of sentence I didn't know I needed to hear. And you sat on the floor again, even though there were chairs, even though the couch had room, like you knew instinctively that something about being close to the ground made it easier for me to breathe. And we ate quietly, like people who knew better than to fill the silence too quickly, like people who understood that healing needs stillness the way fire needs air. And after breakfast, you asked if I wanted to go for a walk, and I said yes. Not because I was ready to be seen by the world, but because being beside you made the world feel less sharp. And we walked down side streets and alleys and places where the noise couldn't touch us. And you told me stories, ridiculous ones, about your childhood and your neighbors and the time you accidentally dyed your hair green. And I listened like a starving person listens to the sound of water, because your voice made the world less hostile, less fast, less full of expectations I couldn't meet. And at one point we stopped at a small bookstore, and you handed me a worn copy of a poetry collection and said, "This made me think of you." And I didn't know how to tell you I hadn't read anything in months, that my mind was too full of static and flashbacks and memories that didn't belong to the daylight. But I took it anyway. And that night, after you went to bed and I lay awake on your couch with the moon curling across the floor like it was listening to, I opened the book and found a line underlined in your handwriting. "Some days the weight is lighter when someone waits for you to come home." And I don't know why, but I pressed my hand to the page like I could feel your pulse in it, like you had reached forward into my loneliness and left a fingerprint there. And I didn't cry, not that night, but I held the book like it was a lifeline, like it was proof that someone had once thought of me in a bookstore and chosen softness on my behalf. And over the next few weeks, something strange began to happen. I started laughing again. Not all at once, not the way I used to, but in small, cautious pieces. Like laughter was a language I had forgotten, but you were helping me relearn. And you never commented on it, never made it a thing. Just let it return in its own time, and you let me be quiet when I needed to be, and you let me talk when I couldn't hold it in anymore. And one night, sitting on the fire escape, with our legs swinging over the edge and a bowl of popcorn between us, I finally asked the question I had been afraid to ask since the beginning: why didn't you push me away? And you looked at me like I was made of something ancient and delicate and said, "Because you're not too much. You're just a lot of story that hasn't been told yet. And I swear I could have cried right there, not because it was poetic, but because it was simple and true and exactly what my bones had been aching to hear for years. And from then on, everything changed, not in a dramatic, movie ending kind of way, but in the quiet, almost invisible way that healing always does, like stitches pulled slowly through skin, like light returning to a room you forgot had windows. And I still didn't tell you everything, still couldn't say the full truth about what I had run from, or what I had done, or why some nights I couldn't fall asleep without checking the locks 3 times. But it didn't matter, because you never measured your care against my confessions, never made me earn your presence with pain. And I started to believe that maybe love, the kind that doesn't demand performance, the kind that stays through silence and fear and ugly truths, maybe that kind of love was real. Maybe it lived in tea mugs and fire escapes and poetry books and burnt toast and the way you always asked me, "Are you okay being seen today?" before we went anywhere together. And I think that's when I realized the truth I had been running from my whole life, that being held doesn't mean being fixed. It just means someone saw the wreckage and said, "I can sit here with you a while," and meant it. There was a shift I didn't want to name, a quiet distance that began to stretch between us like the slow pulling of thread through fabric, gentle but relentless. And I kept telling myself not to notice, not to panic, not to let the old instincts rise, the ones that said everyone leaves, the ones that always showed up first and loudest whenever something started to feel too safe. And I think you noticed me noticing, because you started talking a little faster, laughing a little harder, filling silences we once shared so comfortably with stories you didn't finish. And I tried not to ask where you had been, why the text replies came slower, why the second mug of tea stopped appearing after midnight. And even though I told myself you had every right to build a life outside of the one where I was hiding on your couch, some part of me felt abandoned. Even if you hadn't left, even if you were still there most days, still offering me warmth and space and softness. And I hated that about myself, hated how quickly I folded into fear, how easily I mistook quiet for absence, how my brain still believed love had to hurt to be real. And one afternoon, I caught myself looking for my shoes, ready to leave, ready to disappear before I could be left again. I sat down hard on the edge of your bed and said, out loud, "Don't do this, not to you, but to myself." And I think you heard me, because you walked in with a laundry basket on your hip and said, "Do what?" And I looked up and said, "Leave before it hurts." And you didn't laugh, didn't flinch. You just set the basket down and sat beside me, close enough for our knees to touch, and you said, "I know you're scared. I just wish you'd believe. I'm not going anywhere," and I wanted to believe you. Wanted it so badly it made my throat ache. But the truth is, I didn't know how, not really. Because every person I'd trusted before had built love like a contract, not a home, and you were the first to make it feel like shelter. And that terrified me, because I didn't know how to exist without being ready to run. And when I looked at you, eyes shining with things I couldn't say, you just reached for my hand and said, "Even if you leave, I'll wait for you to come back." And I think that broke me more than anything else could, because it meant you knew I still might go, still might unravel, and you loved me anyway. Not with conditions or ultimatums, but with the quiet kind of love that lets people fall apart and come back without shame. And after that, we both tried harder. You started texting more. I started talking more, and we built new rituals. Ones we didn't name, but lived in, like morning walks where we didn't talk about feelings, just pointed at dogs and guessed their names, or sitting on opposite ends of the couch reading different books but still reaching for each other's feet like touch was a way to say, I'm still here. And one night, you told me about your own chaos. About the year you stopped answering your phone and let friendships die because you were too tired to keep being the one everyone leaned on. And I listened like it was sacred, because it was. Because. For the first time, I saw the cracks in you, and they didn't scare me. They made me feel less alone. And I told you that, said it like a secret. And you smiled like I had just handed you something heavy you didn't know you were still carrying. And from then on, we talked more honestly. Not all at once, but in steady, careful layers, and I started to believe that maybe the things that broke us weren't here to destroy us. Maybe they were just here to teach us how to be held, how to be loved without performance, how to build something soft in a world that tells you you have to be sharp to survive. And sometimes we fought, not loud, not cruel, but quiet little ruptures over things that didn't matter but carried weight anyway, and you never stormed off, never shut down. You always came back with soft eyes and said, "I'm not leaving just because it got hard." And every time you said that, something inside me came a little more undone in the best way. Damn. And I think that's what made it different. What made you different? You never tried to fix me, never treated my healing like a timeline, never looked at me like I was something tragic or tender or temporary. You just stayed, and even when I pushed, even when I got quiet in that way, that meant please prove you still care. You stayed, and some nights I'd lie awake listening to you breathe from the other room and think, if this ends, I'll carry it anyway. Not because I was preparing for loss, but because I finally had something that mattered enough to grieve. And maybe that's what love is: willingness to risk the ache, to stay when the waters rise. It was the day you didn't come home when you said you would, the day your phone went straight to voicemail and the sun sank a little too fast for comfort. And I told myself you were probably just caught in traffic, or forgot to plug in your phone, or lost track of time, the way people do when they're happy or distracted, or just human. But somewhere underneath the logic I had built to protect myself, there was panic, cold and familiar, crawling up the back of my throat like it had been waiting for its moment to return. And I walked circles around the apartment, checking the window every few minutes like you'd appear out of thin air. And I told myself not to spiral, not to assume. But then the sky turned to night, and the silence in the space you usually filled became unbearable. And I found myself dialing your number again, over and over, like repetition could conjure you. Like the sound of the ringing could push back the rising tide of fear. And when it didn't, when nothing changed, I sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, shaking, remembering all the stories you had told me in peace. Is about the time you used to disappear for days, about how sometimes the world got too loud and you couldn't breathe and you just vanished. And suddenly the things you had survived started echoing in my head like warnings, like ghosts, and I whispered your name into the empty room like it might matter. Like maybe you'd hear it from wherever you were and decide to come back. And I didn't sleep that night, just lay on the couch with the porch light on and your hoodie in my arms like it could substitute for your heartbeat. And in the morning, when the sun broke across the wall and the front door finally opened, I almost didn't believe it was you, standing there with swollen eyes and apologies spilling out of your mouth like they'd been building all night. And I didn't yell, didn't demand answers. I just wrapped my arms around you and whispered, "You're here, you're here, you're here." Over and over until your shoulders started to shake and you collapsed into me and we sank to the floor. The two of us tangled in grief and relief and guilt and something so tender it hurt to hold. And eventually, in the low light of the morning, you told me you hadn't planned to come back. Not because you didn't love me, but because some part of you still believed that you were easier to care about when you weren't visible, when you weren't asking anything from anyone. And I held your face in my hands and said, "You don't have to disappear to be loved." And you cried in a way I had never seen before, like your body was letting go of something it had clung to. For years, something heavy and poisoned and old, and I stayed with you on that kitchen floor all morning. And we didn't talk about it again for weeks. But something shifted that day, something fundamental. Like the bond between us had been reforged in fire, tested and tempered, and made stronger, not in spite of the break, but because of it. And after that, we checked in more, left sticky notes on mirrors that said "still here" and "don't forget to breathe and call me, even if you don't know what to say." And we started doing little things for each other that weren't about love in the way the world defines it, but about safety, about noticing, about seeing each other fully and still. Staying, and you began to trust the light again. Began to let the windows stay open, began to smile without apology, and I kept showing up. Not perfectly, not always with the right words, but always with my full heart. Always with the promise that leaving isn't my instinct. And slowly, we both began to believe in things again, like stability, like soft mornings. Like the idea that two broken people could hold each other without cutting open the same old wounds again. And even when the fear came back, as it always did, we learned how to hold it together. Learned how to sit with it instead of trying to kill it. And sometimes that meant just holding hands in silence, or watching sad movies and pretending the tears weren't about ourselves. And sometimes it meant saying, "I'm not okay, but I still want you close." And that was enough. That was everything. And the more we survived together, the more I understood what it meant to be kept, not just loved, but truly kept, the way you keep something fragile, the way you keep something sacred. The way you keep someone who once believed they were impossible to stay for. And I started calling you home in my head, not out. The thing about staying is that it never looks like a movie. It looks like reheated soup at 3 a.m. Like folding laundry without being asked. Like knowing someone's silence well enough to sit beside it without needing to fill it. And by then, we had built a rhythm so quiet and intricate that most people wouldn't have seen it as love. But I did. I felt it in the way you always turned the kettle on before I even asked. In the way you kept a second toothbrush in the bathroom even after I'd said I'd be leaving soon. In the way you never once made me feel like I was too much when I had nothing to offer but my presence and my breath, and the shaky attempt to keep choosing life on the days when even that felt impossible. And you told me once on a walk past the old brick houses near the train tracks that loving me felt like carrying a fragile glass lantern through a storm, not because I was weak, but because everything about me glowed so fiercely it made you afraid to drop it, and I didn't know how to respond, so I just reached for your hand and held it like it was something I could memorize. Like touch could translate into trust, and we walked until our shadows disappeared in the early light. And I wanted to tell you then that I had started leaving notes in my phone that said things like "stay, and you're not alone, and this feeling isn't forever." Not because I was in danger again, but because I had finally learned how to write to myself the way you spoke to me, gently, without demand, without urgency. Just the quiet insistence that I deserved to exist. And it was strange, feeling like I could finally breathe again without checking over my shoulder for permission. And there were days we didn't talk much. Days when both of us retreated into the private caves our brains had built before we found each other. And I never once resented you for that. Because I knew what it meant to need the quiet, to need to disappear without disconnecting. And you always left the door open for me, always texted, no pressure, just checking in. And I'd reply with a single heart or a song lyric or nothing at all, and you never took it personally. Never made me feel like my coping was inconvenient. And when I finally reemerged, when I finally sat on the end of your bed again, like I had that first week, you just smiled and asked if I wanted tea, and I said yes. And that was it. No interrogation, no guilt, just welcome, just presence. And I think that's how you saved me, in ways I'll never fully be able to explain. Because the world never taught me that love could be quiet, that healing didn't have to be loud to be real. That some of the strongest connections are made not through words, but through breath shared in silence and grief held in soft, steady hands. And I started writing again, slowly, scribbling bits of poetry into the margins of old receipts and journals I'd given up on. And you never asked to read them, just let them exist. Let me exist. Like my creativity wasn't something to be mined, but something to be nurtured. And one night, curled up under that stupid blanket you always insisted was ugly, but I loved anyway, I finally said it. I said, "I think I love you," and you didn't blink or flinch or change the subject. You just reached over and touched my cheek and said, "Of course you do. You always have," and I didn't cry right away. But later that night, in the quiet of your arms, I let it all fall out of me. Not the kind of crying that wants to be stopped, but the kind that means release. And you held me through it like you had every other storm. No urgency, no impatience. Just that same quiet truth you had always carried, that I didn't have to explain my chaos to be worthy of safety. That I didn't have to prove my softness to be worthy of being kept. And the next morning, we didn't speak of it, didn't name it. Just moved through the day like something sacred had been spoken and didn't need to be repeated. And you brushed my shoulder in the hallway, and I pressed a note into your hand that it was the kind of day that felt heavy before it even began. The kind where you wake up and everything feels too loud, too sharp, like the sunlight itself is an accusation. And I knew from the moment I opened my eyes that the weight was going to follow me, cling to me like fog. But I didn't say anything. Just moved slowly through the apartment, folding into corners, trying to make myself small without disappearing completely. And you didn't push, didn't ask, you just noticed, like you always did. And instead of talking, you turned the lights down, turned the music off, made the space gentle. Like you were building a nest around me with the quiet, and I wanted to thank you for that. Not asking me to be more than I could manage, for seeing that I wasn't okay without making me say it out loud, but the words were too far from my mouth. And so I just sat at the kitchen table, watching the steam rise from a cup I couldn't bring myself to touch, and you sat across from me, with your hands wrapped around your own mug, not saying anything, just breathing, just being. And somehow, that was more comforting than any sentence you could have spoken. Because you weren't trying to fix me, you were just holding space for me to exist inside of. And as the hours passed, and the sky outside shifted from morning to afternoon, to something in between, I felt the ache inside me soften just enough to move again. And when I stood up and walked into the living room, you followed, not too close, not too careful. Just enough for me to know I wasn't alone. And I curled up on the couch, not because I wanted to talk, but because I wanted to be near you. And you understood that without needing to ask. And you sat beside me with a book in your lap and one leg pressed gently against mine, and we stayed like that for a long time. The silence between us soft and full, like a language all its own. And eventually, I rested my head on your shoulder, and you tilted your head to mine. And I think in that moment, I realized I didn't need to be anyone else to be loved here. Didn't need to be bright or brave or functional or healed. I could just be tired and quiet and honest and still be worth staying for. And that kind of love, the kind that doesn't perform or parade itself, the kind that waits quietly in the dark and says, "I'll be here when you're ready," that kind of love rewrites things inside you, rearranges your idea of what it means to be safe. And I wanted to tell you all of that, wanted to pour every word of gratitude and awe into the space between us, but all I could manage was a whisper, barely audible. "Thank you for not needing me to explain." And you nodded like you heard it all, like you understood that those 7 words carried 1,000 more behind them. And you squeezed my hand gently, not to comfort me, but to remind me you were real, and there, and staying. And that night, we didn't cook dinner or watch a movie or say much of anything. We just let the quiet do the talking. And I fell asleep with your hoodie wrapped around me and your presence wrapped around my fear. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't wake up in a panic, didn't reach for the edge of the bed to make sure the world hadn't vanished. While I slept, because you were still there, and in the morning, when I found a note on the counter that said, "It's okay to need days like that," I held it to my chest like scripture. And I realized something no one ever taught me: being held doesn't always look like arms around you. Sometimes it looks like someone noticing your silence and loving you anyway. Sometimes it looks like soft lights and no questions and a cup of tea that you didn't drink but still meant the world. And I think that's what made you different. What made this different: you didn't just hold my chaos, you learned its rhythm, learned its quietest cues. And you didn't run from it, you stayed. And I think I'm still learning how to stay with myself the way you stayed with me, still learning that I don't have to feel okay to be loved. I don't remember the exact moment I stopped checking the door every 5 minutes, or flinching when someone said my name too softly, or bracing for goodbye in every silence. But one day I caught myself laughing without looking over my shoulder, to see if I was allowed to, and when I realized it, I looked up at you, and you were already watching me, smiling like it was a sunrise you'd been waiting for. Like maybe the real victory was not in the healing, but in the fact that I had let you witness it. And I think that's what struck me most about the way you loved me: not that you stayed, but that you never once demanded to be the reason I got better. You just sat with me in the quiet, in the wreckage, in the trembling middle of all the things I couldn't fix, and because of that, stopped needing to be fixed at all. And I remember one night when I was doing the dishes, and you walked up behind me and wrapped your arms around my waist and rested your chin on my shoulder and said, "Do you realize you're standing in a place you once ran from?" And I didn't know what to say, because I hadn't thought of it that way. Hadn't noticed that the place where I used to collapse had become the place I stood tall. That the version of me who once slept in your hoodie on the couch afraid to breathe had somehow become this someone who cooked and cleaned and showed up for themselves. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had learned how to hold it differently. And more than that, because you had shown me what it looked like to be held without shame. And I wanted to tell you all of this, wanted to sit you down and pour it out, this map of becoming that I never would have drawn without you. But when I turned around to face you, you were already looking at me like you understood. Like you knew without needing to be told that the storm had passed and the roof you helped me build held steady. And I didn't need to explain the way. Your presence had been the lighthouse and the anchor and the fire escape all at once. Because you never loved me for how much I needed you, you loved me in the ways I forgot I was lovable. And now, when people ask me about you, I never say they saved me. I say they saw me. And I think that's the difference, because being saved still sounds like I was something broken, something drowning. But being sign being, really, truly sign means I was something whole the entire time, just buried, just scared, just waiting for someone to sit beside the silence long enough for it to bloom into language. And when I look back now, I don't see tragedy or chaos or loss. I see 1,000 soft moments that taught me I could be loved as I was, not after. I got better, not when I could explain it, but right in the middle of the mess. And when I left your apartment for the last time, not because I was running, but because I was ready. You didn't cry, you just helped me zip my bag and said, "Come back if you ever forget." And that sentence has lived inside me like a compass ever since, and every now and then, when the world gets heavy again, or the quiet feels too loud, or I lose track of myself in all the noise, I pull out the old note you left in my jacket pocket the night I told you I loved you, just a scrap of paper. Your handwriting slightly smudged. 5 words I have built a life on ever since. You are not too much, and I keep it close, not because I need to remember you, but because I need to remember who I became in your presence, who I was always allowed To be, and if love has a shape, I think it looks like that, like to people sitting in the dark, saying nothing and still feeling heard.